Ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome to this academic session. We appreciate your presence here during the What Design Can Do event 2014 this afternoon. I would like to invite Professor de Rijk to come to the stage and give his inaugural address entitled On Design Culture and the Future.
Ladies and gentlemen, don't be afraid. Most of the lectures given at this conference, many museum exhibitions on design, and all the design history books have in common the fact that they focus on change, renewal, and improving that what exists. I say this because I'm also very interested in the greater part of material culture that does not change. And I like to draw the attention to the view that themes such as authenticity, nostalgia, and tradition should not be regarded as a matter of course and therefore rejected or ignored. This lecture for the What Design Can Do conference in this beautiful theater is one such form of expression of a well thought out and cultivated tradition. This historic decor, the cortege and beadle, and the cap and gown that are responsibly part of this present a suggestion of authenticity and constancy. The inaugural lecture is a good example of what the Canadian sociologist Dean McCannell, in his book The Tourist, calls staged authenticity, an activity that gives the spectator the idea that he is experiencing something real, but is also something that has been specially devised for him or her and is carried out as a part of a historic continuum. In this case, you are the tourist, and I am the academic equivalent of the native tribesman who preserves the tribe's customs as carefully as possible for you. So I would not wish to deprive you of such a staged inaugural lecture in its most conventional form. This location, a theater, a traditional epitome of an artificial condition that represents an intensified realism, is nothing less than a gift from me, with you all in front of me and the real world directly behind me. The desire for constancy, for unchange, which is not only a psychological desire but also culturally determined, can also be as a survival strategy. Whatever we are talking about, standardized interface symbols, classic handbags, or the paraphernalia of hard rock, over here, that which has no longer existed is familiar, usually functions perfectly, whereas that which is new is in danger of not being understood. But there are also objections that undermine the importance of constancy. My lecture today is about the tendency toward change and the captivating idea of the future, as these are both so deeply rooted in our culture in general, and that in your design culture and my design culture in particular. I shall attempt to show you how our idea of the future has become uncertain over the past 100 years, how yesterday's and today's designers approach that idea, and how my chair can contribute to a productive debate which is so evidently lacking in this discipline. In the first place, culture is by nature conservative, but shared norms and values do change, although this is often a slow and sometimes almost unnoticeable process. The cultural meaning of handcrafted objects, for example, has changed independently from form and execution, and almost exclusively in relation to time and place. Over the past century, for example, craft has been artistically innovative, luxurious and elitist, nationalistic, anti-international and regional, socialist, fascist and therefore good, fascist and therefore bad, impoverished, old-fashioned, nostalgic, regional, anti-industrial, and once again, artistically innovative. This is a picture I got from the Design Academy and it's taken in 1979, by the way. A typical characteristic of Western culture is also the tendency to embrace and implement change in various forms and for various reasons. One of the constant values in our culture is the predilection for change. It is an apparent contradiction that modernist design is literally envisaged with a search for the eternal, archetypical form of the product, as well as radical innovation that is often inspired by technology. Changes in products and their design are driven by countless processes and social views. The capitalist system, for example, has a need for permanent change. Think of car catalogs, seasonal presentation of furniture, and new fashion collections. Change is also driven by ideologically motivated ideas about the makeability of the future. Permanent change is, as it were, inherent to the journey towards an unattainable utopia. In all these cases, a vision for the future has the most appeal if it already appears to have been realized, or is in any case presented as tangibly as possible. A small-scale study I once carried out revealed significant similarities between the immense success of catwalk shows and that of the concept car, for which American car manufacturers openly looked to the Paris fashion industry in the 1920s and 30s. In Leiden, my art history students are studying the phenomenon of the model house, which manifested itself during the greater part of the 20th century as an ideologically inspired vision for the ideal house as well as the ideal lifestyle. The model house seemed to bring the future within reach, and the modern lifestyle that went with it was something that could be learned. Both were provided by a new professional, the designer. Of course, in the case of a model house, other parties such as property developers, energy providers, technology companies also have an interest in such future scenarios. But we expect designers to know what the future will look like. The attraction of design is that of life itself, with its permanent development of plans for the future, and the suggestion that the designer is the ideal person to bring about the changes. It is the claim to this role that characterizes the design world, and is the future-oriented approach with a perpetual motion of change that has penetrated deep into design practice, into design education, and into the practice of design history. Design has a centuries-long history. On balance, that history is even longer and richer than that of the visual arts. Unlike architecture or the visual arts, however, the discourse of design, and product design in particular, is hardly based on history. This is mainly because design should be future-oriented, a notion that is heavily at odds with the development of a history that can be actively utilized. Passively utilizable history is, of course, all around us. History once functioned as a visual lucky dip and has now been largely replaced by Google as a permanent mood board. What remains is history as so-called history, with its own constant, meaningless, and deadly boring grammar of forms. In this sense, the future serves as a counterpart to history, with the designer in the here and now as a main link. Obviously, the future is determined by the course of history. But in the case of designers, this process is usually reversed. The way in which history is written depends on how the future is presented or envisaged. And that is the only form of historiography on which designers appear to focus, that of historical legitimation. This manifests itself, for example, in a designer's admiration for a historical kind of spirit, one who is preferably dead and therefore not a danger. Or it is a legitimation in the form of a historical series, for example, a series of products that leads automatically, as it were, to a highly specific future scenario, often one that the designer himself has designed, of course. An interesting and well-known, very well-known example of this type of deterministic design for the future is the 5-year-long series of chairs, designed by the Hungarian architect-designer Marcel Breuer. In his sequence of images, presented as a Bauhaus film in 1926, Breuer speculates on the plot of the future as a nothing that is both desirable and inevitable. Things are getting better every year, and ultimately we will be sitting on elastic pillars of air, Breuer claimed in German. Completely in line with the Zeitgeist philosophy that was so popular in early modern German art, the designer announces that it is not he, but life, that presents or even rightfully demands this natural evolution. Breuer, the designer, is the implementer, or rather, the chosen one, who serves as the voice of modernity and has no choice but to comply with the inevitable process of modernization. At the time, an apparently similar blankness or nothingness also represented a very different proposition. On the cover of the well-known booklet Der Stuhl from 1928 by the modern architects Heinz and Bodo Rasch, the blankness appears to invite all possible interpretations, with the understanding that history remains absent. Only the Western sitting posture is historically determined. The place of the design is still a tabula rasa, like undeveloped land that has yet to be built on, or a naked human being who has yet to be clothed. These images of non-existent chairs, or rather ways of sitting, accurately summarize the ambition of heroic modernity in design. Product design as a development of history, and design that attempts to turn its back on history and denies or destroys that which is old and constantly beginning with something new. This is the modernity that sociologist Zygmunt Bauman called solid modernity, a modernity that permanently renews a perpetual state of modernization, but with a fixed foundation and from a known framework. It is modernity of order, and Bauman places the designer literally at the center, as he writes. The drawing board was one contraption the modernity could not exist without, and the profession of the designer, of drafter of blueprints, was the best entrenched of modern vocations, one that emerged intact from all and any changes of style and fashion. Modern society had an enormous thirst for legislation, defining norms, setting standards for beauty, goodness, truth, usefulness, and happiness. Bauman is here concerned with a design practice without history, without context, and literally without a reference work. It is this solid modernity that was the basis for structuring a planned industrial society, one with a varied ideological basis. In 1937, architect-politician Adolf Hitler promised that he needed only 4 years to transform Germany into a country of international standing that was economically prosperous and above all innovative in terms of military technology. The exhibition Gebt mir 4 Jahre Zeit, held in Berlin, displayed the results of the first period of the Nazis' planned economy. With this first extremely appealing presentation of the contours of a new Germany, Hitler seduced a large part of the German people into believing in an unknown future. Give me 4 years' time, and you will not recognize Germany. This solid modernity, with its desire for standardization and planning, led to the founding of new design schools in Western Europe and the United States in the 1950s and 1960s. It was apparently evident that these design schools, such as the Eindhoven Academy and the Industrial Design School at Delft University of Technology, both in the Netherlands, and the Ulm School of Design in Germany, all well known, could not be direct heirs of existing study programs in the decorative arts. Instead, they were new schools with a new mission, namely to meet the needs of a society that was not only being reconstructed, but was also expected to undergo radical change. In the field of design education, the standard examples were the artist, on the basis of its claims to the avant-garde, and the engineer, on the basis of the future it could systematically bring closer. My institution, my first institution, Delft Institute of Technology, pondered for a long time on the government's request to set up an industrial degree program. The board eventually decided to do this in 1963. 2 students registered for industrial design. One of them is here. Modernist designers that were employed, such as founder Joost van der Grinten, Emil Truijen, and Wim Krauwel, regarded engineers in general, and industrial designers in particular, as the most far-reaching and systematically deployable instrument in a civilizing offensive. At Delft, knowledge relating to man and design could be objectified Technical construction and ergonomics, as the most objective forms of knowledge, were at the heart of that design. But the aim was highly normative, namely a materially perfect world of comfort and efficiency. To a certain extent, the engineer was a metaphor for design and the designer, an example worthy of emulation with planning, order, and engagement as the most important symbolic ingredients. Precisely at that time, when the new design schools were being founded, the first examples of a new form of modernism emerged. This new modernism was no longer production-oriented, but consumer-oriented. Zygmunt Bauman called this condition liquid modernity, and I shall explain it with an example. Coincidentally, or not, but in the same year 1963 that the design school in Delft was founded, the Philips company developed the compact cassette recorder. This player recorder would develop into an innovation that almost literally changed our view of the world, an advance that to a certain extent could be compared to the compact photo camera and the photo album. However, Philips had in no way foreseen that the compact cassette would be such a commercial success. The player was intended as a professional recording device for journalists and secretaries. But consumers subsequently adopted it, and the meaning and function of the device changed completely. The enforced standardization of cartridges, cassettes, was the precondition for ready acceptance on a large scale, and at the same time a precondition for complete freedom of use. Worldwide use of the cassette recorder had far-reaching consequences. It facilitated subcultures such as punk and disco, it spread revolutionary messages in the Middle East, and it destroyed the corporate music industry in countries such as India completely. The portable recorder enabled consumers to record sounds in their environment and music from the radio, fragments of the real world. Recording songs became an individual and a shared experience. We would record the world in a sequence of our own, choosing, and we would always erase it and start again. In his autobiography Life, Rolling Stones guitarist Keith Richards describes his love of the Philips cassette player as a device that could amplify, record, erase, and play music, and to his joy, produced a gritty, impure sound. In his words, what came out the other end was electric as hell. The cassette recorder epitomizes the metaphor for what Zygmunt Bauman calls liquid modernity, with its condition that had to be constantly redefined, and above all, a future that apparently could not be based on order and programming. It had to be constantly reformulated and could not serve as a foundation for a new situation. A cassette recorder was a piece of equipment with unforeseen functions and a new meaning, and the imperfection of the sound it produced was embraced. Clearly, this is completely at odds with everything an engineer represents, and caused Knut Iran, head of design at Philips in those days, to lament, "What is beclouding our crystal ball?" For many, Bauman's liquid modernity was still completely volatile, and the future was by definition unimaginable. Designers seemed hardly to understand or respond to the new condition. And study programs continued to resort to the role models they had always used as examples, the artist or the engineer. The appeal of the future as a driver of continual change thus became trapped in a paradox that began to manifest itself in the 1990s, when the design profession made a transition from making objects to inventing ideas for the future. The practical making of objects had always been linked to an ideological future-oriented motivation, whereas the development of ideas for the future, concepts and services rather than products, appeared above all to be a basis for rediscovering the raison d'etre of the designer. The role models of the traditional engineer and the romantic artist degenerated into unfounded choices for the design profession. The design discourse and the capacity for self-criticism were clouded by the almost automatic relationship to the methods of the arts or an almost vernacular approach to technological subjects. Even today, the field of design lacks a form of critical debate, such as still takes place in architecture, for example. In the Netherlands, such a debate took place during the 1990 conference How Modern is Dutch Architecture, held in honor of Rem Koolhaas' professorship. The main conclusion was that the objective analytical approach and the related language of forms had degenerated into a dull-edged classroom modernism. Almost 25 years later, today, this type of debate still needs to take place in the design world, so that it can reflect critically on its position and thus formulate questions for a new age in a global world. Today, we both love and hesitate to face the future, especially if this involves a revolutionary elan. Car manufacturers present concept models that later turn out to be production models, whose design has been interpreted as futuristic for the past 50 years. It seems that utopian model houses have ceased to exist. At best, the future has been replaced with the wish to formulate the future, carefully and without obligation. The Prada fashion house, for example, doesn't develop clothes for the future, but launches an essay competition on the theme of the future. In this unstable no man's land, we once again welcome the romantic projections by artists with a supposed visionary talent, or trend forecasters with an oversensitivity to changes over time. Not infrequently, applied technology has a symbolic character in their work, or personal projects are clothed only with the visual aura of experiment. The U-turn is visible and tangible in design courses everywhere. Design schools in Denmark, New Zealand, and Australia are developing a form of fantastic design anthropology. The design duo Dunn and Raby are teaching their speculative design at the Royal College of Art in London. And my colleagues, Heckert and Van Dijk, have developed the vision in product design approach. In these widely differing methods, design is advocated as the formulating of propositions for the future. It remains difficult to determine the context within which the propositions function, and these futures are usually defined by means of extrapolation. All things considered, extrapolation is a historical method. Knowledge of the future is thus based on how and to what extent the present differs from the past. The way in which the future manifests itself is proposed in a schematic and logical scenario. Another way of imagining the future is the what-if method, in which it is easier to make use of improbabilities. This approach was first explored in the military world, mainly in early 19th century Prussia, through the Kriegspiel, the war game by von Reiswitz. The American Rand Corporation later developed the approach into commercial and societal applications for the American Army, as well as the petrochemical company Shell. Even today, there is still intense discussion on the question of whether, and if so how, Shell actually understands the future. But I think that question is not very relevant. Shell responded more effectively than any of its competitors, for example, to the energy crisis of 1973, which came as a totally unexpected for many. Rand had managed to persuade the oil company to rehearse the future, and crucial parts of the company were geared to permanent change. In my view, this type of exercise and self-reflection is the most important contribution that the chair of Design, Culture and Society can make to the design world. In the first place, the expertise of the Art History Department in Leiden can serve as the basis for a resumed academic study of historical modernization processes and the critical examination of the role of design and the designer in the world. The work of the department at Delft will enable Leiden, in turn, to form a much more accurate picture of the practice, discussions, and ambitions in today's world of design. There is little of essence to be discovered about the future, but both the extrapolation method and the what-if method are unthinkable without respectively historical knowledge and critical cultural analysis. Remarkably, the Faculty of Industrial Design at Delft and the Decorative Arts program at Leiden were both established in the same year, 1963. I feel a connection with the first Leiden professor Theo Lunsing-Scheurleer and his interest in the social significance of the decorative arts. I notice a connection with his successor and my predecessor, Professor Willemijn Fok, who for a long time and with a great deal of energy communicated the academic significance of the history of decorative arts. I feel a connection with the Delft historian Henri Baudet. He held the view that art historians understand nothing of design culture and design history, but hopefully he can take posthumous reassurance from my approach. And I feel a connection with my Delft predecessor, Professor Jan Willem Drucker, and the Leiden professor Titus Eliens, who have inspired and had a decisive influence on so many students and me. Give me at least 4 years to make the chair of Design, Culture and Society relevant for students and academic teachers and researchers, for design historians in museums, for interested companies and certainly for designers. Within the chair, I recognize the short and the long lines of history. In order to underline this, I am keen to work with institutes within and outside the academic world. I would like to illustrate that ambition by referring to a collaborative project with the new institute in Rotterdam. In that context, I have already mentioned the research into the model house. I further like to mention the work we do with Utrecht Manifest, a biennale on contemporary social design. And finally, I'm pleased to announce a collaboration between the Chair of Design, Culture and Society and the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. In order to give concrete expression to the shared interest in academic research into design, a new endowed chair in the decorative arts before 1800 will be established in Leiden. The day before yesterday, the Leiden University Board decided that the chair will be held by Dr. Reinier Baarsen, a senior curator at the Rijksmuseum. Highly esteemed boards and dear colleagues of the universities of Leiden and Delft, ladies and gentlemen, I sincerely hope that I can live up to the expectations you all hold. I thank you for your attention. I believe in our future. Ik heb gezegd.
Professor de Rijk, I am not tempted to give a summary of your exhaustive, elaborative, interesting, excellent inaugural address. But I can tell you, we will give you at least 4 years. This inaugural lecture, called the public lecture, has been the one where, in this case, Professor de Rijk expressed his vision on the field and expressed what he's going to do in the future. And we will see to it, within 4 years, I would say, Professor de Rijk, if that is going to be true. Leiden University and Delft University of Technology, its proud deans that are here, both the academic community and all of us, we feel very fortunate with such an distinguished professor amidst. Congratulations to us all, I would say. Ladies and gentlemen, all good things must come to an end, at least this part of this afternoon. And the same applies to this session. We have herewith come to the end of a short academic ceremony in this inspiring setting of what design can do. We will continue with a reception in the Koninklijke Foyer for a selected group of invited people only. The cortege will leave, and this group will leave with them this room. And of course, after the cortege has left the room, there will be an interesting program remaining for the rest of the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your presence and attention, and I herewith pronounce this academic ceremony closed.
And